So today you're in for a real treat. We have a conversation between two of the Writers' Festival favorites, moderator Dr. Coy Lay and Kirk Wallace Johnson. Kirk is an author and screenwriter. His books include The Feather Thief, Beauty, Obsession, and the Natural History Heist of a Century, and To Be a Friend is Fatal, the fight to save the Iraqi Americans left behind. He is the creator of Drug Spies, a scripted series about pharmaceutical espionage. His writings have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, the LA Times. I'm going to just stop there and just say he's everywhere. Please join me in welcoming Kirk Wallace Johnson and Dr. Coy Lay.
Welcome back to the library. What a crowd. I couldn't believe people were filing in an hour ago to grab their free copy.
It's a slow day.
And welcome back to you. This is your third time here, but I think it's like your fifth session or sixth session or something like that. So you're an old hand here in Rancho Mirage. But, there's a lot to cover in this book. And so what I'd like to do, if we can put up a first picture. I want to get right to the story, because that's what we all want to hear. And it's kind of like a disturbing picture. Do you want to?
Sure.
So what I'd like to do is just go right to the events of the book, and then we'll start talking more about it.
So what you're looking at is not from the 1950s. This is Galveston Bay, Texas, 1981. And this is a shrimp trawler that was sent out full of Klansmen, heavily armed. If you look at the back, there's an effigy hanging from a noose from one of the outriggers. And they went out that morning in search of Vietnamese fishermen, shrimpers and crabbers that had been resettled to the United States after the fall of Saigon in the previous several years, and who had basically ended up on the Texas Gulf Coast, and they were trying to rebuild their lives as fishermen, and doing so well at it that they provoked a very nasty racist backlash from the whites that had traditionally dominated this industry. They tried first to get the governor to ban refugees, and when that failed, they brought the Ku Klux Klan in, and the Klan started firebombing Vietnamese boats, Vietnamese homes, and then doing these very public actions where they were going out terrorizing Vietnamese shrimpers in the bay in full view of the rest of the
I think
public.
the next picture, we've got one more, just want to put, because it's so brazen, right? So it's not like in the middle of the night with face covered and things like that. They're just out there.
There's some remarkable stories behind these pictures. There was a photojournalist from the Houston Chronicle who just happened to be off that day, and he was down. This is in a little town of Seabrook and Kemah, these sister towns on the bay. And he was just eating a shrimp sandwich when he saw this Klan boat drift by, and he raced to the car to get his camera, praying that there was film in it. And I looked at this photo many times while writing this book, but if you see, there's the effigy of a Vietnamese refugee. Here's a woman doing a Heil Hitler. Here's just normal citizens. Here's a guy having a beer, and I don't know, it's hard to tell the resolution, but a lot of these people are just smiling. This is not a particularly disturbed reaction, which I'm not, I'm not one that jumps to quick judgment, but some of those people I've come to judge pretty harshly for how they're responding to this.
This is 1981.
Yep.
I think, but really this story starts a couple years earlier, right? There's some events in a town about 2.5 hours away in Seadrift, and maybe you can tell us about that.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm going to just depress the hell out of the room if we're just staring at someone.
Why don't
in
we take that down at this point? Yeah, thanks.
So, I mean, I can't even look at that thing that often. I want to say one quick thing before we get to that. Thank you all for having me. Thank you to the festival for having me. You have a real gem here in Coy. Like I've done tons of events. I have never encountered anyone that has prepared it. Like he knows that like my grandmother's maiden name. I'm not kidding.
It's a little bit creepy.
Thank you all for coming. And then the only other thing I'm going to say, just because I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror back there, I don't always look like an 8-year-old boy. My wife cut my hair. She started cutting my hair during the pandemic, and she cut my hair yesterday right after she finished cutting my 6-year-old's hair, which, for those, if you might remember, it's all about just getting it done quickly. So I just got a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and I'm like, geez, babe, like you didn't leave any here. So I promise I'm not 9. Okay, so back to the Ku Klux Klan. This really this did not how do I put it? So after the fall of Saigon, the American public did not want to open its doors to Vietnamese refugees. We now think very fondly of this community, and we're proud, and we should be proud of what we did to help them. But as Saigon was falling, it was something like 32% of the country that supported it, and the rest were vocally opposed to it. But President Ford, this is often forgotten about him, but he ignored public opinion, and he said, I don't care, this is the right thing to do. He said, we have to help these people, and to do less would add moral shame to humiliation, was the line. And within about 6 weeks of him saying this, the Congress gave him $300 million. They passed the Indo-Chinese Refugee Migration Act, and within about 90 days, we opened our doors to 130,000 Vietnamese in the first wave, and then over the course of the coming decade, to nearly 1 million refugees from that conflict. A lot of those in the first wave ended up in 2 places in Southern California, and then the second largest community was in Houston and in the Galveston Bay and on the Texas coastline. I think in part because the climate was a little familiar to them, but also because, as we were just saying, a lot of them had fished and crabbed and shrimped back home. And at first, so picture 75 to the late 70s, this had been a kind of horrendously bad few years of fishing along this coastline. All kinds of hurricanes and other disasters. And so you had all of these Vietnamese coming, and they wanted to buy boats. And the whites at the beginning were very, and it will sound like I'm generalizing, I'm talking about white fishermen here. They were delighted that the Vietnamese were there because they sold them these decrepit boats, oftentimes for 10 times what the true value was of the boats. I met a lot of Vietnamese that they bought a boat, and then as soon as they brought it out of the water to work on the engine, the hull would fall out because it was so rotten. But the whites thought that they had a bunch of suckers on their hands. What the Vietnamese ended up doing was they fixed these boats up. They were living 10 to 12 to a trailer. Instead of using a deckhand, where they would give a quarter of their earnings away to someone else, a family member would work on the boat. They ate fish from the bays that white people consider junk fish. And within a few years, they had become so good at this and so efficient at what they did by working together that they presented an economic threat to the whites. And so this tension was building and building and building along the coastline. And the book opens on one man in particular named Billy Joe Applin in the small town of Seadrift. 800 people in this town, and within a couple years, it swelled to 1,000. But the 200 new residents were all Vietnamese refugees that were there to work at a crab picking plant because there was a plant there and they couldn't get any white people that were willing to do this hard work. So the Vietnamese moved to town, they start picking crabs, and the men start shoving out crab boats, and basically these tensions kept rising and rising where the whites just did not want the Vietnamese there. They kept claiming that the Vietnamese were violating the unwritten rules of the Bay, like that you're not supposed to crab late at night, or you're not supposed to drop your traps too close. But they weren't written anywhere. There's no laws against them. The Vietnamese didn't know what they were doing wrong. And this all boiled over one night when Billy Joe Applin, who basically was just sick of the Vietnamese, he had one particular young man in his crosshairs, and he just started pummeling him down by the docks, said he was going to kill him, pulled a knife out and cut him across the chest. And this young man, an 18-year-old who had been getting threats from Billy Joe all along the way, pulled out a gun that he bought from Walmart and shot Billy Joe dead. And then ran for his life because he was going to turn himself in to the police until the other Vietnamese in town told him that the local police had been infiltrated by the Ku Klux Klan. So which might sound crazy, but it was a pretty common thing back then in Texas. And so he turned himself in, 200 miles away, and the assumption was that there would be a quick trial, he would be sentenced to death, and that would be a Texas justice. His trial was heard in a very conservative part of the state in front of an all-white jury, and that all-white jury voted to acquit this young Vietnamese man on grounds of lawful self-defense. Some of those, yes, it's an admirable thing what happened there, and I've read the voir dire where they're doing jury selection, and it was a hellishly complicated thing because there were so many Texans who were like, sorry, I know we're supposed to say innocent until proven guilty, but I think those guys are guilty, and so then they would get struck from the jury pool. But so you would think, so a lot of people were heartened and inspired by the acquittal of this young man, Sao Van Nguyen. But what happened was that acquittal, when it hit that small town where this killing happened, they felt that justice was denied and that something must have gone wrong, and that if they weren't going to get it from the courts, they were going to get it some other way. And so that's when the Klan came in, and things took a very different turn.
But the town, as you point out, there was a town hall meeting, right? And the city council or the town council.
Yes. So there was a kind of mysterious thing. So after the acquittal, these rumors start ricocheting throughout town that the Ku Klux Klan is going to come march, and they're going to do an investigation into what went wrong with this trial. And no one knew why the Klan was suddenly interested in this or who had invited them. But this town of, roughly 1,000 people at that point, all gathered together in the school auditorium, and this was recorded, it's incredible footage, and they unanimously voted to condemn the Klan and to say, you're not welcome in Seadrift. The Klan came anyways, in part because when they came, all of a sudden, Walter Cronkite, like his producers were out there. This was national news when the Ku Klux Klan came. It made it even better story for the media, but also for the Klan. But there was a very, marked effort by those in town to keep the Klan out. What I found, and this has always been a mystery for 40 years since all of this happened, who invited the Klan, who brought them in, and the FBI spent years looking into this. I now managed to find an answer because I managed to get the widow of Billy Joe Applin, the man who was killed, to agree to an interview, and it was in that interview that she admitted that he had joined the Ku Klux Klan in the months before he was killed. And this was a secret. She had been keeping it a secret for decades. She burned his Klan robe so that no one would find it. But the mystery is a little bit resolved at that point. The Klan came in because one of their own was killed. But that action, they came in, they did a big march. There were no improprieties in the trial. There was nothing that they were really investigating. They were just there to get press. Because when you get press, you get new members. And so shortly after, parading in front of Cronkite's cameras, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan was able to open up a new chapter in Seadrift, of a new Klan chapter. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of then became the model for what was to come. So all of that happened, the killing and all of that happened about 18 months before what you saw there in Galveston Bay. But everyone knew what was that this was not a resolved conflict at this point.
It was one of the things that you write about is that the night they were acquitted, there's kind of like this hell breaks loose, or I think maybe it was the night of the shooting, but some of the white fishermen went and firebombed this apartment garage, right, where there's this Vietnamese family, and then one of the guys who did the firebombing.
Yeah, this was like there's one thing I've learned with these types of investigations is you often need to go back to the well many times before, because people don't often sense or have an instinctive knowledge of what a nonfiction author might be looking for. And so I managed to find some of the people that were part of a mob that went out firebombing Vietnamese boats and homes, and I got them to speak to me on the record, and one of them was really kind of unburdening himself, and he was describing in intricate detail and showing me on the map the route that this posse took and how sick he felt when they set fire to a home and there were a bunch of elderly Vietnamese refugees and 5- and 6-year-olds running out of the burning building. And I think it was maybe 5 or 6 interviews later, so we've been talking for dozens of hours over months at this point, that he just sort of casually mentioned, we went back to the events that night, and he said, after I put the fire out, I went back home and I had a really bad night's sleep, and I kind of stopped him, like, what do you mean you put the fire out? And he goes, yeah, well, I was the guy who drove the fire truck for the town.
It's like switching hats.
And I was like, Richard, you didn't think that was important to me? That like you set it on fire, and then so I'm like, so now tell me what happened. So he set it on fire, and then he was skulking back home, crawling through this trench and avoiding rattlesnakes and things, and he was hoping that no one would see him, and he knew he smelled of diesel from the Molotov cocktails, and he was walking by the firehouse just as the siren went off, and one of the firefighters ran up and he said, "Get in," and Richard knew exactly where to drive.
He was the volunteer driver.
Yeah, he was the driver. So those are the things that have made
me.
Town. It's a small town, but also, a lot of times the things that make these stories, I guess, more textured or come alive more, you don't find them out unless you're really obsessive and kind of almost annoying to your sources.
Well, I mean, you uncover stuff that I don't think anybody was aware of at that time because, but statute of limitations on arson is just 10 years, right? So you can tell you.
10 years in Texas, but on hate crimes, there's no statute.
Is that right?
But that would require somebody from the Justice Department now trying to press a case, which I don't think they will.
So your story then shifts. So that was at the end of 1979, I think. Mm-hmm. And your story shifts now about a year and a half later and 2.5 hours up the coast now to Seabrook. Yes, and there, the FBI and the Justice Department, they knew what had happened in Seadrift, and so it's confusing. There's a Seadrift and a Seabrook. And they were desperate to have this boil over again, and so they were sending mediators on all these little fishing towns up and down the coast, in Louisiana as well, to try to bring the camps together, to have the Vietnamese hear in Vietnamese what the quote-unquote unwritten rules of the Bay were, but also to try to, they were all signing these sort of gentlemen's agreements to just leave each other alone. And not build more boats.
Not to build more boats, although it's one of the, this is one of like, you don't have to have an advanced degree in economics to understand how this was spiraling. The whites kept selling crappy old boats to the Vietnamese and then using this extortionate amount of money that they got to build new boats. And so there were more and more boats fishing these bays. And the whites felt that the bays were being depleted because there were too many shrimpers. That's what I thought when I started this investigation. I thought, okay, there's only a small number of shrimp. This is a turf war over, a finite amount of a crop. But what became clear to me very quickly was that the whole time that this was playing out, all the journalists were writing about it as a turf war, but no one was actually studying or writing about the turf itself, which is that the Texas coastline, this is the heart of the petrochemical industry. This is where oil was discovered in America. And for decades and decades leading up to when the events of my book begin, all of these small towns along the coast had been offered up by senators and governors and others to big industry, to Dow, to Exxon, to all of, Union Carbide. All of these petrochemical plants started popping up along the coastline where it's not just oil refineries, they're producing plastics and all kinds of really toxic raw ingredients and chemicals for industry. And in the process, they're impounding fresh water from the rivers that fed these bays, and they're giving that fresh water to the plants to use in their processes. So there's less fresh water coming to the bays, and they're also giving all the plants discharge permits to dump this toxic stuff into the bays. They're dredging the bays deeper. They dredged all of the roads along the Texas coast back then were just paved with oyster shells because it was cheaper than asphalt. So they would dredge up these, 1,000-year-old oyster reefs and just grind the oyster bones up or oyster shells up for gravel. So you have the story of intense ecological destruction, highways built all along the coastline for hotels, parking lots, concrete poured over estuaries. This way of life that was so sort of romantic and idyllic was just under assault from every front. Constant tanker collisions in these bays, deep water oil spills that would burn and leak oil millions of barrels for a year at a time before they would cap them. So lo and behold, the shrimp start dying off. And all of that starts happening right when the Vietnamese got there. So the white people look at all of these huge systemic reasons that are as a result of big industry, as a result of society writ large, for people's vacation homes and hotels and things. Every time it rains in Houston, 3 days later, all the shrimp die. This is true now. All the shrimp and crabs die in Galveston Bay because of all of the pesticides. It takes about 3 days from everyone's lawn pesticides to wash down into the bay. And they're full of toxins that kill these things off. But faced with all of that, the whites didn't go on and fight Exxon. They look at this small number of maybe 100 Vietnamese people who, with all love to Texas, they didn't want to be in Texas. They would have given anything to be back home. They're there trying to rebuild their lives, and they're working so hard because they don't want to go on welfare. And because they worked hard and because they were succeeding, these white fishermen said, they're the reason why everything's going wrong in my life. Let's get rid of them and everything will be great again. That's the really base story at the heart of this, and it's why I wrote this book, because it may seem like we're talking about something, kind of anachronistic or something faded from 40 years ago, but what happened there is happening again now, and it will continue happening as climate change intensifies, as our resources diminish. In 25 years, this is where my wife always tells me to pump the brakes a little, because I'm like, this is my Swedish mentality, but like I have a kind of bleaker view of humanity. But in 25 years, the higher end of the projections are that we're going to have 1.2 billion climate refugees. Climate change and environmental destruction is producing more refugees now in 2022 than wars are. So this is something that happened a long time ago, but part of the reason why I wanted to have the title evoke something of a parable is that, hopefully if you read it, that you will see that it's actually it's just another iteration, and it's something that's going to play out, I think, with increasing intensity in the years to come. This is why I feel like I'm just depressing everyone. I'm sorry.
Well, there is some kind of a good story in here that is a little bit more uplifting, and things are boiling up in Seabrook, right? And there's, okay, it's a little bit depressing. You're right. But there's a few days in a row of some boats being burned. Yeah, and now the KKK is getting involved again. Feds are coming to investigate. I thought it was fascinating. You write about the ATF, the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. So they send an investigator to come, and this guy comes and kind of looks to see who may be burning these Vietnamese boats.
Yeah, so even with the knowledge, this is another thing about, we talk about like some maybe structural biases when it comes to law enforcement or those in power. Everyone knew that Vietnamese boats had been burned down in Seadrift. People had admitted to it at some point. But when they started burning up in Galveston Bay, the FBI and ATF send arson investigators, one of whom that I wrote about was a SEAL team or Green Beret in Vietnam. And he gets down to Galveston, sees this torched Vietnamese boat. The next day or a couple days later, there's 2 more boats that were burnt. And he concludes in his report, which I had to get through a Freedom of Information Act request from the FBI, but he said that the Vietnamese probably burnt their own boats as a way of garnering sympathy. You have to understand that the Klan was having rallies in Galveston Bay where 1,000 people, and I've talked to a lot of the ones that were there, they emphatically told me, no, I was not Klan. I hate the Klan. I'm revolted by the Klan. But they put themselves present in a rally where everyone was chanting white power, get rid of the Vietnamese, and a 90-day deadline was given by the Grand Dragon of the Klan for the Vietnamese to get out, or else they would face blood, that they would face a worse fight than they dealt with in Vietnam. And so 60 or 70% of the Vietnamese fishermen were making plans to run. They put for sale signs up on their boats, and they were about to become refugees again.
But they, you had mentioned that they were really tied there because economically they had almost bankrupted themselves to buy these boats. And you had said, gave an example, one boat that someone bought for $25,000, and then he spent $9,000 fixing it up. And this is in 1981, so I kind of tried to figure out what that is in today's terms, and it's like $130,000. So it would have been devastating economically for these families to just walk away from these boats, right?
Yes.
But they were still
they were on the
verge
brink
of doing that, and then some guy shows up from Alabama, and this is where
it's a combo of a couple key things that happened. So one, there was this very charismatic colonel from the South Vietnamese forces. He had commanded thousands of men at the peak. He was never planning on becoming a refugee, but as Saigon was falling, when he brought his family down to one of the last boats, they wrenched his car keys from him and threw it into the water and pulled him onto the boat. And so he ended up coming here, and he was pumping gas for $3 an hour in San Antonio after he was in charge of the defense of Saigon in the final month of the war. And so he had spent 22 years fighting. I spent a lot of time with this man. He's 84 years old now, Nam Van Nguyen, and shot and wounded several times throughout the war. And he finally, after all of this fighting, he buys himself a shrimp boat and a little fish house, and he just has this dream of living a quiet life. And as soon as he gets there, the Klan comes to town and starts burning boats and telling them that he has to get out of there. And this is not somebody that is a shrinking violet. And so I often joke it's not of all refugee groups to pick a fight with, the Vietnamese are probably the last. Like these people they've lost everything, but they also are not particularly scared of many things, and I'm generalizing here, but that in so many conversations I had with Vietnamese where I would sit across the table and sort of in shock go through these events of like, well, how did you feel when this Klansman raised his rifle at you, and they kind of had to speak to me as like this sort of sweet little boy, like, do you have any idea what we were dealing with before the Klan came, and so what it meant, though, was that they were, so this colonel basically organized the Vietnamese into the Vietnamese Fishermen's Association, and he pledged that they would stand their ground not with weapons, but by fighting back in the court, by putting their trust in the Constitution. And they had help. Help came in the form of a lawyer named Morris Dees, founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who had a pretty striking fall from grace the week after I got the book deal for this. But Morris was this good old boy from Alabama, grew up, his grandpa was in the Klan, his uncle was in the Klan, his ancestors fought in the Confederacy. He basically sat out, I'm sure he'll watch this and then send me an 8-page letter critiquing what I'm getting wrong with it. But he basically sat out the civil rights movement. He was at law school. I mean, he was on campus at University of Alabama the first day it was integrated, and saw Autherine Lucy being pelted with bricks and eggs, and he watched. And I'm not condemning him for this, but at each step of the way, he had a law degree. He was also actually actively. He represented one of the first clients he ever took was Claude Henley, and he was representing one of the whites that beat up the Freedom Riders.
Wasn't he also on the campaign staff?
Yes, he was. This was before. George Wallace was never a real prince, but this was before Wallace's hard right pivot. But he was George Wallace's student campaign manager. Yeah. So he was not. His credentials as a white Southerner were sterling. Trying to be somewhat diplomatic, but I don't really care that much anymore. But he didn't care about the civil rights movement. He wanted to get rich, so he starts a company with another guy named Millard Fuller, who went on to found Habitat for Humanity. This is quite a combo. And those two went on the most colorful. They launched so many businesses that when they were college students, they dipped wreaths in silver paint and sold. They sold Christmas trees, and they folded their earnings. They soon owned whole apartment blocks on campus. And when he was 30, Morris, at that point, they were multimillionaires because they were selling cookbooks. He told me, he's like, people were so dumb, I could sell blank cookbooks. I would just sell a blank book and they would write their own recipes into it. So he's a salesman, okay? But he's a salesman with a law degree. And one day, after he sells his company, for I think at the time it would have been $30 million or so as a 30-year-old, he's on a flight. He gets stranded somewhere, I think in Cincinnati or something, by bad weather, and he picks up Clarence Darrow's memoir, where he reads all about how Clarence Darrow wanted to put his law degree to work and to help the disadvantaged. And so that's why he started the Southern Poverty Law Center. And in the beginning, they were really tackling these tough, systematic cases where, the Alabama state troopers had never had a black trooper. Morris sued them, and they integrated. He discovered that the YMCA, so this is things that shock people now, especially people more my age that have never really studied the civil rights movement. But after they desegregated public pools in Montgomery, and this happened all throughout the South, the whites, rather than have their children swim with black children, they just filled the pools with concrete and turned them into parks. So there's a lot of parks around the South that actually have pools buried under the grass, and then they would use the YMCA and other organizations that would then have these subtle exclusionary policies so that the only white kids would be able to swim there. So Morris discovered all of that and sued the YMCA, and starts doing the hard work. He was taking on death penalty cases, but he needed to fund the organization, and people don't like writing checks for death penalty cases. Until he realized he took on one Klan case, and the whole world, it seemed, opened up their checkbooks when Morris started fighting the Klan. And so the second Klan case that he ever tried was this case. And so this is a kind of, one of the trickier aspects of this is that he did something really remarkable here. I mean, the Vietnamese ended up suing the Klan. They sued for an emergency injunction where they sued the Klan and a whole bunch of white shrimpers to assert and to protect their rights to fish these bays. They had every right to fish there.
So it was a civil case.
That's right. So there was no investigation into who burnt the boats or the homes or anything like that. It was basically a leave us alone, let us do what we're allowed to do kind of assertion. But it also had another component, which was that the Klan at the time had an incredibly well-trained and fearsome militia that was training in federal grasslands all throughout the state, and the militia was the sort of the pointy end of the spear that was making these threats real. And in this case, with Morris's help and with the Vietnamese standing strong, they not only enjoined the Klan against coming anywhere near the Vietnamese, they also broke the Klan's militia apart. So the head of the Klan, who was going to take this model and go on, put it on steroids and copy it everywhere else in the country, he suddenly now is on the run because he's got a warrant for his arrest for some. So they did something really remarkable. But the whole time that this was happening, Morris is writing to all of his donors in California saying, "Send money as soon as you can. I'm fighting the Klan." And I'm guessing here, but I think they have raised tens of millions of dollars off of this case. Now, I'm very proud of that organization. They did something important here. But one of the things that happens towards the end of the book is that I think that entrepreneurial side of Morris, the kind that kind of cackled when he was selling Americans blank pages. The Southern Poverty Law Center started basically only doing Klan cases and then not even doing many cases anymore. They were just constantly raising money off of the specter of the Klan and of white supremacy. So by the end of the book, they're hardly trying any cases anymore, but they are today one of the most well-endowed nonprofits in the history of this country. Morris was thrown overboard. Like I said, a week after I did my deal for this, and my publisher anxiously called me and they're like, "Can you write this book and just not put Morris in it?" And I had to, like, before I even wrote the book, I had to then write this kind of essay on how we need to stop infantilizing the American public, that they're way more mature than we give them credit for, and that he did something very good here. It's never been conclusively established what happened with his downfall, but it's in the Me Too ballroom. Let's call it that. But
maybe let's not call it that.
Well, it seems. I wanted to. Okay. Correction. Okay. In my defense, a ballroom can hold a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of people who deserve to be Me Too'd on it. But yeah. So, but that we can't go back into history now and remove this guy because of what he did 40 years later. What if? To me, he became a little bit more interesting just as someone to write about that. What if he, by doing all of these good things, felt that gave him some kind of license to indulge in these sort of bad things or these sort of inner demons of his? I don't know, I basically had to make the case that, like, I'm not going to alter history because of what happened. And I mean, to their great credit, I mean, Viking, they didn't bet.
And that trial is a huge pivot point in this book. And, the trial is interesting because you can tell us about the judge for the trial.
Yeah, by sheer coincidence, but the federal judge who heard the case was the first female African-American judge ever appointed to any of the southern benches. She was the first African-American judge ever appointed in Texas. to the district court, and the head of the Klan.
That must have been a bummer for the Klan when they walked in.
Well, and in fact, I did a long interview with this judge, Gabrielle Kirk McDonald. She's a remarkable woman. It's the first time she's ever talked about the case, and they tried to get her to recuse herself because of her skin color, that she couldn't. And she then
you need to find a colorless judge, I guess, right? Because
so
everybody's got a color, and
and that was her.
Yeah.
There's very clear benchmarks for a judge to recuse themselves, and that she pointed to a very important case where there was a suit in New York where it dealt with sexual harassment with women who weren't being invited for interviews at a law firm, and in that case, they were trying to say that a female judge should not be able to hear it, and that judge, Constance Baker Motley, who's an iconic judge, said, well, then men shouldn't be able to hear it either then. Like, they're the ones doing the harassment. Like, why should, so there's a... So the same applied here, but but it was the whole time she never confided this until decades later, but she was getting the most horrendous, she was getting death threats. I found through the Freedom of Information Act what she had received in her chambers throughout. I can't even describe it without, it's so offensive, the white supremacist and Klan material and letters that were being sent to her. But she ended up, she heard it on the merits, decided on the merits, and basically the Vietnamese had not done anything wrong here. They had every right, and she affirmed that. So there is this story deals with some heavy subject matter, but the gender thing is important. So that beyond Judge McDonald, there was one female shrimper along this entire coastline who lived through all of this. Her name's Diane Wilson. I don't know that I would have written this book without her. She was there that night that the boats burned, that the home burned in Seadrift. She's from Seadrift. She's a fourth-generation shrimper. And she kept saying to her male colleagues, leave the Vietnamese alone. They're not your problem. The problem are those plants. She kept pulling up mutated crabs and shrimp into her nets, and she kept saying, we should take on these petrochemical plants. Wasn't getting anywhere. And she watched her male colleagues sort of descend into this insanity and this base race war against the Vietnamese. But she kept doing her own thing, which every time she pulled up a mutated specimen, she would mark it, the date that she found it, where she found it, and she'd keep it in a little freezer. She didn't really have a plan. She just sensed that this was something important. This went on for many years until 1989. She opens up the newspaper and discovers and reads on the front page that her little town in her county of Seadrift is the most polluted in America. This area that I've been describing is now called the Cancer Belt. So I got to the point that I could tell who worked at what plant based on the type of cancer that they had.
Just the food was so contaminated too.
The food was the water is contaminated because these plants are just dumping stuff into the aquifers. The air was the most toxic in America.
Susan and I visited Galveston Bay in the mid-'80s. I was looking at maybe doing part of my training in Baylor, Houston, and we went to Galveston Bay and someone who was hosting us took us out to a crab shack. And after reading your book, I was like, oh, I should have ordered a hot dog.
To your point, one of that boat that you saw in the beginning. So I managed to get the guy whose boat that was, who loaned it to the Klan that day, to talk to me over many interviews, and I asked him if he eats any of the shrimp that he catches now, and he just laughed. And he said, there's one channel, the shrimping's great. We call it DuPont Channel, after DuPont Chemical. There's a big plant there. But he's like, we all have to wrap our faces up before we go because the air is so foul, and you never want to get any of the muck from the nets on any of your skin or on your clothes because the stink just stays for days. And I'm like, but wait, you're selling that shrimp? And he goes, yep. And he's like, but I would never eat it myself. And so so Diane sees all of this, and she discovers that this town where like she's raising her 5 children is now this toxic dump. And she starts on a 30-year battle with this industry, with the petrochemical industry, where, and I recount this in the last act of the book, but where she loses everything dear to her. Her husband leaves her. Her kids are pissed at the amount of time that she's spending. She's doing hunger strikes. She's going to the governor and protesting. She's doing everything she can think of. She doesn't know how to take on a massive multinational corporation. She becomes a pariah in town. Her own brothers won't talk to her anymore. She's pushed to the brink of taking her own life at points, but she kept persisting in monitoring what the plants were doing, and she started realizing that they were dumping these little plastic pellets into the bays, so she would start gathering these pellets, and then she organized volunteers to gather these plastic pellets, and she, in 2018, made history as the largest ever settlement in U.S. history under the Clean Water Act, awarded to her against Formosa, which is a huge offender, a toxic dumper throughout the world. And she now represents, honestly, one of the last hopes for any of these fishermen. That money, she's not taking any of it. She's 75 years old. She lives on $405 a month of Social Security. She finally has health insurance through Medicare for the first time in her life. And that, I think it's $50 or $60 million that's going towards rebuilding fish houses, towards cleaning up the bays, towards building a co-op so that these fishermen start working with each other to share their catch and to get a better rate for it rather than competing against each other and driving it down. So I will just say that it was not lost on me that the one person who could see clearly and who could properly identify the threat to this way of life was a woman. I would take that.
I'm gonna ask for. We're towards the end time, but I'm gonna ask for 10 extra minutes because there's a few things here that I want to cover.
I'm happy if you guys are.
We'll sit here all night, this stuff happened, most of it, like the year you were born. So
yeah.
How did you hear about this story? I mean, how did this come to your attention?
I never would have imagined an origin story like this, but on December 3rd, 2018, my dad died of cancer that was spurred in large part by his exposure to Agent Orange during the war. He was in the Army. The same week that he retired and celebrated his 50th anniversary with my mom, he got a stage 4 diagnosis, and he was gone 4 months later. And I was here in Los Angeles, and I'd been going back and forth, but I was in LA the day he died, and I told my wife that it felt strange to just sit around at home as though it were a normal day. And I felt this kind of uncontrollable need to go fishing. My dad had taught me how to fish, and I thought it would be a way of kind of communing with him. And the closest fly fishing for me is in Kern, which is 3 hours or so up from LA, southern Sierra Nevada. So I throw my gear into the trunk. I'm driving up. I was so kind of out of it that by this time, the time I left, the sun was setting. So out of it, I'd been driving in dark, and I realized that I had never turned my headlights on. So I was just driving in darkness. But I had the radio on, and I wasn't really listening to it. But this song comes on by Bruce Springsteen. And it's called Galveston Bay. It's from an album of his, The Ghost of Tom Joad, 1996. And he starts singing about this young Vietnamese man who's shrimping in Galveston Bay, who has lost everything. He's just casting his nets into the water, trying to rebuild his life. And then all of a sudden, Springsteen singing about the Klan coming in and trying to get rid of this guy. And I didn't know anything about this. I didn't think it was, I thought it was such a strange premise. I was like, man, Bruce, like you're really stringing a tale here for us, you know? But it kept popping into my head over the subsequent day and weeks. And then finally I just went on to Google and realized that he had based this song on true events. And then I thought, well, it's someone else probably wrote a hell of a book, but I couldn't find any books about it. And then I thought, well, everyone's probably dead. But lo and behold, like I just started one after another making contact with everyone that lived through this. And in many cases, a lot of the confessions that I got for some of these crimes, a lot of those people died within 6 months, often from COVID. So I do feel like I found this story in the final moments.
But, you know, a lot of people have heard that song, but you're the only one who wrote a book. And I you know, there's the song, but I think it feels like you're kind of primed to be more sensitive to a number of the issues here. You know, it's about refugees, and you've devoted your kind of adult life to working with refugees. Kurt's first book, Kirk, at the age of 24, was in charge of the USAID project to rebuild Fallujah.
Does anyone know Fallujah anymore? It's been a while. Like
the
thing is, when I speak to college students, they were all born well after all this, so they don't know what Fallujah means anymore.
And his first book is and even it goes back before that, because his grandmother, who lived next door to him, she opened up her home after she was relatively well-to-do, and she had a good, but she opened up her home, and they hosted refugees from
Ukraine,
and Russia too. I have to be,
yeah.
and Hmong,
yep.
Right. So this was in the 80s where you're growing up. So you know, you've exposed to that sensibility as a child, and then you've also spent all these years. And you know, when we pulled out of Iraq, Kirk had many friends in Iraq who were left behind and were threatened. And this first book is about his efforts to try to save as many of those people and get them out as possible.
And so actually the title of my this comes full circle, but the title of my first book is called "To Be a Friend Is Fatal," which is something, it draws upon something that Henry Kissinger said as South Vietnam was being overrun and we were abandoning the South. He said, you know, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And so Vietnam had always hung over my work. A lot of my mentors, so I basically, many of my colleagues, as Coy said, were assassinated because they had worked with me and they were seen as traitors for helping the Americans. And I was angry that our government had abandoned them, and so I was 25 then, but I started speaking out and waging what became a decade-long battle against our government to get visas created for these people, and for the Iraqis and for the Afghans that were risking their lives to help us. And the board members of my organization, many of them were Vietnam hands who were there during the fall of Saigon, that were giving me counsel on what works and what doesn't work and how they did it. And so I had always studied Vietnam because there was this initial period of abandonment, but then, as I said, we did open our doors up and we did something incredible. And I mean, I grew up with Vietnamese and Hmong classmates in the suburbs of Chicago, and they were just close friends of mine. I never even thought to think about how they got there, why they were there. They were just part of our community at that point. But for all of my reading into the fall of Saigon and as part of my refugee work, and that I had founded an organization that we got thousands of refugees out and then tens of thousands of visas created for Iraqis and Afghans. But I had never paid attention to what happened to the Vietnamese after they got here. So that's why the Springsteen song kind of, I guess that, a combination of my dad just dying in part because of delayed consequences of his own deployment to Vietnam, I was primed. And I know, I mean, nonfiction authors are supposed to say that they go into things and to a project without any bias. I think that's silly. I think everyone has a bias. And the truth is, I do have a very strong bias in the belief that our country is strengthened when we open our doors to people who don't look like us and also having been in the war, having seen what we are capable of doing, what we ask our young men and women soldiers to do to others, it is nasty, and it destroys people's lives. I mean, between France and the United States, we decimated Vietnam. Iraq is a fragment of what it once was. So do I think that we have an obligation to open our doors to Afghans who are now fleeing a lost country? Yes, I do. So, and yes, I have a bias against the Ku Klux Klan. But the way I tried to write the book was to, I guess, by doing such exhaustive interviews and research, you know, the white fishermen that are doing this, I hope don't come off as cartoonish. You may not agree with them, but I at least want you to understand why their brain kept seemingly taking the wrong choice at each fork in the road. And you can condemn what they did for sure, but I didn't want it to be a kind of sanctimonious.
It doesn't read that way, but you'll judge for yourself. And I think I've asked all of you to stay here long enough, and I drove out just to see you all from LA. So part of me is like, well, hell, you come out here. So if I'm totally happy, but I'm trafficking in some depressing stuff. We're going to put Kirk
here,
at the back to sign book, and please come up to him with your questions and comments. But I really want to thank all of you so much. You've been just a great audience. You've listened. So, anyway,
thank you all
very much.